Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the easing of lockdown, legal and practical considerations for returning to work. Thank you for joining us, and we're delighted to be hosting this webinar today in partnership with TrustLaw. So some of you have probably heard me before. My name is Josie and I'm Capacity Building Programs Manager here at NCVO. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Sarah Valentine, who's Senior Associate at Eversheds Sutherland, Andrew New, Head of Education and Training Products at St John Ambulance, and Adriano Mancinelli, Programme Manager for TrustLaw at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So government guidance setting out plans for the gradual easing of lockdown and the possibility of returning to the workplace comes with inevitable legal and practical implications for organisations to consider. So questions that are probably arising are, what health and safety obligations do we have to employees? What should we be thinking about in carrying out a risk assessment? And how can we be preparing for what will inevitably be a new normal? So to help us try and shed some light on the answers to these questions, in this webinar, we're going to be looking at the following. So we're going to be starting with Sarah, who's going to give us an overview of some of the legal and practical considerations for organisations, as well as things to consider for any risk assessment. Then we're going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to take us through the experience of St John Ambulance, what they have done and how they are preparing for this new normal. We're then, slightly unusually for our webinars, going to have a 15-minute session for questions. So do please submit your questions during these first two presentations. And then finally, we're going to be closing with Adriano providing you an outline of some of the practical resources and support available through TrustLaw. And then I'm also going to be telling you what's coming up in terms of practical support and resources offered by NCVO. Before we get started, just two final things to note. So there will be some, with a lawyer on the call, there will be some legal information provided during this webinar. However, just to note, this is for general information only. We don't consider this legal advice, and it won't create any lawyer-client relationship with you or your organisation. The other thing to say is that, as always, we will be recording the webinar, and the recording will be sent to you afterwards. The webinar recording will also be available on our NCVO know-how site in our coronavirus section. Just to say on that, when you get sent the recording, with the link, sometimes you do have to scroll down, because we've done a number of webinars now, so you do sometimes have to scroll down to the actual recording of this webinar, just to let you know. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Thanks, thanks, Josie. Hello, everybody, and good morning. First of all, I think we were going to kick off. We thought it would be quite useful with a poll to just see where everybody is in terms of that getting back to work following the roadmap to rebuild the UK that the government has introduced. So it would be really helpful if you could just select one of these categories of the four, just trying to get a feel of where people are. Are people already there doing it, or are people still a bit anxious and waiting to go back? What are people's thoughts? While people are completing the poll, I think it's really been quite helpful timing for everyone and for all of us today that the government have issued some more guidance, and in the last few days they've relaxed the current state in terms of the pandemic to a level 3. So hopefully we're going to be giving you some hot off the press information today from the government. So that's going to be really helpful as we go through the journey of getting your workforce back. So here are the results. A lot of people, it seems, preparing for this, which is really good. Some are holding off at present, some still thinking about it. And it's quite interesting to see that very few have already, only 5% have actually brought their workforce back to work. So to be honest, that's really kind of the feelings that I'm getting from clients who are approaching me. Some of them a little bit apprehensive to get back. So I think that is quite a good indication of where we are more generally across all business groups. Right, should we just briefly kick off with just the legal responsibilities? I thought it would be really helpful just at the outset, just to really briefly outline the framework that we need to be thinking about when looking and managing COVID-19 risks. Obviously, the fundamental piece of law is quite old law now, the 1974 Health and Safety Act, that we'll all be fully familiar with, and our duties about protecting the safety, health and welfare of our employees, and that extends to occupational exposure to COVID-19. So they're in the fundamental sections of 2 for employees, 3 others, visitors, contractors, self-employed, and section 4 that relates to the premises themselves, so they're safe and suitable. The next one, management of the health and safety regs, that's all about risk assessment, which we'll come on to, a very big part of getting part of your planning in place to get people back, COVID-19 risk measures. And there's also things we need to comply with that are issued by the Health and Safety Executive. Their bank of guidance is phenomenal on their website to get loads of information about things. Also, we've got to unfortunately contend recently with additional guidance from Public Health England and NHS, as well as the government. So it feels there's quite a lot of things we've got to capture and keep up to date with to make sure we're kind of riding the crest of that wave when we're putting measures in place for COVID-19 safety. And finally, I've just popped on about duty of employees. So whilst there is a lot of onus on us who are leaders in these businesses, we should make sure that employees are aware of their own duty to protect the safety and welfare of others they work with. And that really extends to them about them following the UK guidance and adhering to it in terms of not coming to work with symptoms, advising if they're on a test and trace service, or and also about hand washing and things. So they're following that at their own guidance. If we just have a quick look at where we are in the government's Our Plan to Rebuild roadmap, the key highlights of this are the mandate is still to work from home where possible. And I think I can see from the poll we had at the beginning that most organisations and businesses are doing that. We had some guidance issued on the 11th of May, and that was for about 6 or 8 sectors on returning to work. That ranged from construction to offices and healthcare providers. Yesterday we had that extended to visitor economy and close contact services, so people can finally get haircuts and hopefully go for a drink in a beer garden. They also gave evident guidance about COVID-19 risk assessments, which we'll touch on, the requirement to publish those, the fact that businesses are encouraged to put up a staying COVID secure poster affixed in their premises, the NHS test and trace service has been introduced, and also that there is spot checks being completed by the regulars, whether that be the Environment Health Officer or the Health and Safety Executive, depending on the sector of your business, where they're dropping in to see when people are back, what measures are in place and how we're protecting those employees. One of the aspects just to develop a bit further is that COVID-19 risk assessment. And this is often where we have been advising many organisations about how to go about this, because it is quite an unusual task. What we recommend is that it's a standalone risk assessment. We don't suggest that you put it on as additional risks on an existing risk assessment. For instance, if you're an office and you have an office-based risk assessment, adding these at the bottom, we recommend a standalone, as it's easy to update and it's easy to send around the business. Another thing is to make sure it's done on your standard template. There isn't any sort of standard format produced by the Health and Safety Executive or the government. We recommend it's the usual format you would use, so that your workforce is fully understanding how all those risks and those control measures are implemented. Now, if you're an organisation where you've got a variety of sites, let me take, for example, a bank where you may have offices, but you also have branches which present different risk profiles to you, you can categorise these groups and provide different risk assessments. It's no means any requirement on you to do a separate risk assessment for each premises or site, but what is useful is to perhaps categorise, have a general assessment you can use that may be tailored by managers or health and safety advisors within your organisation for particular sites that take in certain environmental physical changes. There is a requirement to publish, well, a request to publish, but many people are adhering to this, and this is possibly one of the first places the regulators will look if they're looking to come and do a spot check on your business. And it's whether that's external or internal. The guidance on this is a little bit opaque. We recommend that you do a summary, so do your risk assessment matrix, but then pull the control measures into a summary that you can send by an alert, an email, a guidance note, or put on the internet for your employees. That's really part of that engagement piece to get their confidence and make them feel okay about returning to the workplace, as well as making it very clear what's happening and what's expected of them. And also externally, you can also publish those control measures to make people aware of what you are doing as a business and satisfying that suggestion by the government to publish those assessments. I think it's better doing a summary, it's easy to update, it's more user-friendly, but also by putting a risk calculated matrix on any websites or on your intranet may cause a lot of discussion about certain risk calculations, which we don't really want to entertain. A summary is more than sufficient. It could also be used if you've got a customer facing or visitors to your site as a helpful guide sent to them in advance of attending. So again, making them aware. Coordination, I pop that in case you're in any sort of service premises where you may need to coordinate with facilities management about communal areas like lift etiquette, stairs, toilets, visitors and entrances. It's also useful with any sort of health and safety information we're providing to employees, volunteers or visitors that there's either a tick box system where we can tick to see they've read, or they sign to confirm they've understood it. That's always important for us in case anything comes down the line. As a lawyer, we really like to see that people have signed and it means they've understood and it's been communicated to them properly. And tracking the guidance, tracking the government updates to make sure it's live and that the document is current. It's probably useful now, before we move on to just what to put in a risk assessment, where people are in terms of that risk assessment process. Have people started doing this already, or are they still waiting to see if guidance, again, restrictions are lifted and different means need to be put in? Or your business quite happy working from home? My business at the moment is continuing to work from home. It seems that model works quite well for us with a skeleton staff inside, but it's very different if you've got different types of businesses that need to service the public or customers. The next stage, I'll just go through what we need to look at when looking at risk assessments. Also, this is really good. Quite a lot of people very proactively have started the risk assessment process. That's what I'm seeing in terms of clients. A lot of people are starting that process. It's unfortunately quite difficult with the guidance changing because those goalposts are always moving, and it means that we have to keep making very up-to-date and different assessments of risk. A few people have published risk assessments, which is good to see. And some people haven't really started it or not sure how to approach it. That's a fewer percentage. So hopefully some people will be able to share their experiences as we go through the questions on how they've tackled risk assessments. The way I think the best way to look at it is to break it into 4 manageable chunks, and that is really to break that down into practical considerations relating to people, COVID-19 risks, safety management systems and systems of work. I'm talking about the actual work activities our employees, volunteers or others are completing, and the premises, so the fabric of the building themselves. If we start with people, I think it's important communication. I touched on that engagement piece in a few slides earlier. We're obviously seeing that many employees are quite nervous about coming back to the workplace and what that will entail. So I think engaging with them and bringing them on the process, that journey is really important. And that's how helpful guidance in a summary document or an alert can be sent to them in advance and keeping them up to date with what measures we are putting in place to protect them. Guidance, training and instruction is important if perhaps our employees are having to cover different jobs because there's less people in the workplace, and so it's making sure they're fully skilled and have knowledge and the right experience to do those tasks. Checking on welfare is important. People have different setups at home if they've been working there for some time, and checking in with them is really important to see how they're doing. And as I touched on, for some it's quite a scary experience coming back to the workplace, so just that engagement piece is really important. Managing their expectations. It's quite good to provide a forecast of where the company is, what your business is doing in the immediate, in the future as well, so that people really understand where the business is going. And that also helps with taking them along the journey. You may want to review policies and any updates you need. For instance, the test and trace service by the NHS has caused quite a few questions. It's very opaque, unfortunately, and ambiguous in how that should be applied. And really, that is a civic duty than any formal duty on people. So people are having to introduce policies, perhaps to make it clear to employees that if you are contacted on the test and trace, that you notify them, that you do self-isolate as requested. So people are having to introduce certain policies to manage those types of risks. And reasonable adjustments. This perhaps is a little late in the game, because if people have been working from home, we should have been applying them with any equipment that they needed whilst in the office. But as the period at home is extended, it's important that we do check in with these people, checking their self-assessment of their workstations are suitable, and if they need anything that we can reasonably give them. The next bit is looking at the actual COVID risk assessments. What you might want to look at. Some places are doing temperature screening when people come in. Helpful, but making sure that we have a system in place, that we've got the right person doing the temperature checks, that they're protected, and that if someone does come onto site who's got a high temperature, that there is an isolation procedure in place. Again, like I touched on, there is the part of the employees to make them sure that they are following the guidance. It has been instilled into us, but it's still useful to make sure there's posters and alerts around. We've touched on the NHS Test and Trace service and the Test and Protect service, which mirrors that in Scotland. There's other things you might want to be thinking about: increased hand washing facilities, perhaps some disinfectant wipes for workstations and computer equipment and telephones, personal hand sanitizer if people are out and about. Those are things that we might want to implement. Increased frequency and intensity of cleaning of communal areas and desks areas. PPE where that may be required to help people do some of their jobs. Disposable PPE, for instance, maybe with a first aider within a business, may be suitable. And ventilation, we've heard this is very important. The HSE explaining that air conditioning doesn't impact the spread of COVID-19, but making sure where we can that we prop doors open and open windows will be really helpful in terms of if you're having meetings or people back in a room or office. I touched on work activity. It may be that we have to change things slightly. So we're being recommended that it's safer for people to work side by side rather than face to face. So you might have to look at changing your systems to take into account of that. Cohorting. Is it better if we have people coming later in the morning, leaving earlier? Can we stagger start times to limit that social interaction, and also perhaps limit the amount of time these people are having to go on busy commuting trains or buses? Is lone working another consideration we have to think about if we've got skeleton personnel on site while the rest of us are working from home? Social distancing, clearly that's 2 meters, but where possible, if mitigation measures in place, that can be reduced to 1 meter. And making sure we've got signage and information around about social distancing, and it's in place where we can. Checking supply chain if we've got equipment, for instance PPE, that's readily available and we're not going to run out of stocks. And finally, if the worst does happen and we do have occupational exposure to COVID identified in the workplace, understanding our duties under RIDDLE, that's the reporting of these types of occurrences to the Health and Safety Executive. And we need to make sure we've got reasonable evidence. And recently this week they gave some guidance about that. Finally, touching on premises, it's important with premises that we look at various factors. And one of the things I've been advising on a lot is water risks and Legionella. Many sites have been mothballing, which is just simply closing down, locking up and walking away. That itself can cause risks if those flushing of toilets and water systems hasn't been done, which can give rise to Legionella bacteria. It may be that you've had some sort of flush regime in place, which will alleviate those risks. But if not, it might be something you need to engage with an external water specialist consultant if you're thinking it could be a risk for your premises, because you need to make sure that you have measures in place to check that. And if necessary, update your Legionella's risk assessment if that applies to you. Statutory inspections, for instance, lifts, passenger lifts or any other lifting equipment, they're on 6 monthly or 12 monthly statutory inspections. They still have to take place, and the HSE hasn't relaxed that and allowed these surveyors to be key workers. So we are allowed to get engineers and surveyors out to look at this equipment. So if it hasn't been done, get it done as soon as possible or put that equipment out of service. And finally, a bit more of a kind of reorganisation point is, have we had to move desks? Have we closed down meeting rooms, preventing any access for people to group together around kitchen facilities? Perhaps we've got disposable cups in there now. We've moved chairs out, or we've crossed off areas. We've removed remote controls so people aren't using those types of equipment. Really just thinking about how you're restructuring your workplace to make it applicable to those social guidelines. I'm coming towards the end now, but I just thought I'd look at kind of immediate issues to consider in lockdown and maybe a bit of horizon spotting as well. So immediate issues is really making sure we're tracking and mapping the government guidance. So obviously face coverings is now a condition of travel on all public transport. So that's come in. Obviously we've had the different guidance come in now for visitor economy and close contact services, so hairdressers and restaurants and pubs. HSE have recently issued some guidance about gas safety inspections for landlords. They need to be done unless there's reasonable evidence as to why it can't be done. We've also seen a move now towards people being able to combine in households inside and outside. Ceremonies, weddings with a limit of 30 people, and church services are looking like they're going to be taking place from the 4th of July, this Super Saturday. So there is quite a lot of changes coming forward, and it's important that we just keep tracking that guidance. I think there's going to be some updated guidance later this week for businesses more generally. It's making sure that we keep in line our risk assessments with that guidance. Also, just to flag about risk assessments is vulnerable groups. Recently, in the last week or so, there's been evidence that BAME people, so those people from ethnic minorities, are more at risk than others. And so it's making sure we perhaps make additional allowances in our assessments for them. And you may wish to consider a survey just to see what your feel is of your employees to get them back, so you can make sure you're managing their concerns. And finally, I'll just do a little bit of horizon gazing as to what I think we may be looking at when we see past the current pandemic. I think we're going to be seeing that a lot of businesses are going to be changing their workforce models. I think a lot of people are going to be reducing their office footprint and encouraging people to work from home where they can. So I think a lot of people are going to be moving their enterprises from actual physical buildings in the cities. I think people need to be more aware, and I think businesses will be, in restoration planning. Is there going to be a second wave? What have we learned from this one that we can make sure is best in place for us to avoid anything significant happening next time? Do we need to get PPE and continue with that going forward? Let's check with those supply chains. Do we need to make any changes to our safety systems, our systems of work, our activities? And what is the future going to hold in terms of employment and public liability claims? We're yet to see that landscape emerge, but it could be the case that where there's been occupational exposure and that has been confirmed, that we could see some claims filtering through. So that's kind of my summary of where we are with risk assessments and the government guidance. I'll now pass to Andrew New, who's from St John's Ambulance, who can give perhaps more of an insight from his company as to what they've been doing. Andrew.
Sorry, there was a bit of a problem with my mute button there, so apologies. Thank you, Sarah, for that. I'll be going through firstly just a brief introduction to how we reacted to the COVID crisis, and then go into a bit more detail about what we did, what we're doing at the moment to come out of lockdown and restarting operations. So firstly, with regards to the response, I just want to highlight the 100,000 hours that our volunteers have put into the COVID crisis. That's 100,000 hours of patient-facing time in both the Nightingales and a variety of clinical settings across the country. So I thought it was important to highlight that. But I'm here to talk to you about another part of the organization, not necessarily that patient front-facing part, but more behind the scenes with regards to the variety of other services we offer. So in response to the COVID crisis, we used the experience within our senior management to go to a gold crisis management structure, which ensured that we had a single decision-making approach to try and overcome silos and ensuring that everyone understood what was happening with regards to our response to the crisis. We listened to our customers and users and took those concerns that they had in the beginning quite seriously, and not trying to fight against a tide to try and push our own agenda. We took advantage of the furlough scheme fairly early on. We used our industry engagement to work with government and regulators around our training business and the other services we were offered. And we provided our customers and users an authoritative and supportive voice through our key channels throughout the crisis. We also reacted quickly to changing demands, repurposing material to go online, and changing our products and services that we offer. But mothballing a service is a lot easier than starting one up again. And this is a key point we're really beginning to learn at the moment as we go through our preparations for restart. One of the key things we're learning is that it's how do you find a way through the noise that's out there. There's a variety of things going on, and Sarah pointed to that actually government advice regularly changes, and it's very difficult to make plans and stick to them when you're faced with those changes. So in terms of restarting our operations and finding our way through the noise, we started to plan fairly early during lockdown. We understood that lockdown would not last forever, that there will be a time when we will have to come out of lockdown. And we modeled what we thought the recovery would look like. And we took it into a 3-stage approach, where we mapped what each department should be doing at each of the stages of the recovery. We ensured that there was standardized planning across the organization, that everybody was using the same documentation, that there was the same reporting lines, and the same metrics were being produced, so that we got a feel for how the organization was preparing for the recovery and how it would operate under recovery. We regularly updated our documentation and the processes as things changed, and continued to consider how we could deliver our offer in response to each of those changes and each of the stages that we will go through during recovery. Another key learning was, and it was a quote which we went around, that we could just take our business continuity plans and just throw them out the window, because nobody actually planned for something like this. And so what we ensured as part of our planning for recovery was also how we would plan for a second wave, for localized lockdowns, and later on as track and trace came into play. So the 3-stage approach which we're looking at is that we're looking at 3 stages between now and sort of beginning of next year. And the first stage is volatility, which is that difficult to predict period, and that's where we are now. There's unknown political and user behavior, and it's very costly and difficult to match both capacity and income. And especially when you're trying to bring people off furlough, it's quite nice to have that blanket of furloughs covering your salary costs. But actually, you also don't want to have people on furlough and unable to meet increase in demand for your services. We think we'll move into recovery at about after the summer. We expect some suppressed demand. It'll be more stable and slow, our growth, and there'll be a reduction in capacity to meet income. As income, we think, will shrink for a bit, so we would need to reduce our capacity. And then after early in 2021, we start to go into what we're calling our new normal, stable but steady growth, a shrunken economy, and then a greater use of tech and automation. I also mentioned about our standardized documentation, and what we also produced was a standardized checklist, which you'll see on the next slide, which takes you through what we would expect each of the departments to be doing at different stages of the recovery, so that we were able to collect those, have them centrally stored, collect them, and be able to report back of how people are responding to recovery based on how we think it's going. It's also a document that we would regularly change and put out there, so that as we know about different approaches that the government's taking, or if the recovery starts to take a different route that we expected, that we're able to change that quickly and get that out to departments, so that there's that standardized approach. One of the other things that we did was, when the government announced the working safely under coronavirus guidelines, we pulled together all that information and pulled that into a checklist, so that we continue to provide our customers, our users, our supporters with that authoritative and supportive voice as they begin to restart, and capture all the learning that we've had through this process into a single place. And I believe that the URL to that checklist will be circulated with the slides. And that's free for you to use on our website as a way to do your planning. And actually, as of this morning, we have started to make changes to reflect the announcements that Sarah alluded to that have come out last night. So what have we done from that checklist for ourselves? So we've used that checklist as our template for our restart. We've defined what our COVID-19 secure standards are, and we'll be publicizing those on our website, as we set to restart in July. Where we highlight what our safe system of work for trainers are, how we've identified venues that we want to reopen, and actually we've included a video of how our services will change under the current social distancing and safe systems of work that we have in place. We have a structured approach to our risk assessment, so there's clear identification of who has responsibility for them, who approves them, who signs them off, and they are freely available and widely available within the organization. We've involved our trustees very closely, and we have ensured that they have been on board with our approach going forward and that they feel part of that process. We've communicated regularly with trainers and our other employees about how we intend to reopen, and started to provide them with training to prepare them for coming out of furlough and for restarting of operations, so that they start to understand how we move forward. And as Sarah mentioned, we've used this approach of communication to do surveys to get how they're feeling, finding out what they've learned about the way that they would like to work in the future. And for example, we see ourselves moving towards a more home-based type approach with regards to our services. We've done clear communication to create confidence in our customer and user base so that they feel assured that our approach and that our services can be delivered safely and securely under a COVID-19 scenario. And then, as I mentioned, we've put a lot of importance on the flexibility as government finds its way forward, but also as we learn more about the virus and also preparing for that dreaded second wave or those localized lockdowns. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we're now going to move on to some questions. So we have had a few in. So I'm going to field these as normal to either Sarah or Andrew. So I think the first question is really about home working. So perhaps both Sarah and Andrew can give their thoughts on this. So an individual has asked, we are considering the continuation of home working rather than re-establishing an office. What are the health and safety implications relating to working from home? Sarah, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the start of the pandemic, the Health and Safety Executive on their website said that you didn't have to do sort of display screen equipment and self-assessment on workstations for temporary workers, because I think everybody had hoped that we would move through this a lot quicker than we have. However, it's anticipated that that's going to be changing soon, because on the other spectrum, the HSE are very keen to look at avoiding musculoskeletal disorders, which were one of their top priorities in their business plan that they released last year. So I think we're going to see some change in that. So I think it's proactive for businesses to check in with employees, arrange for them to do a very quick check sheet and risk assessment of their workstation to make sure that it is suitable and there is the right setup there, and if necessary, where reasoned and where it is reasonable, that adjustments can be made to aid their working. You may also want to ensure that display screen equipment checks are also done if some time has lapsed since they've been done. So definitely having to do more to protect those home workers. And I think the HSE are going to be making that a little bit more of a job to do, rather than just kind of keep it quite open at the moment, saying that it's just not applying to temporary, because that's now changing as people's models are changing. I don't know, Andrew, if you've got anything that you've been looking at from that perspective.
Yeah, so we're starting to roll that out. As Sarah pointed, that's very we took advantage of with regards to that. It's a very temporary move to move people at home. We're now looking at defining what our new policy is towards home working and looking at what the risk, the sort of health and safety aspects are of that. One thing that has raised its head during this period for us has been about individuals' mental health. And specifically the risks around isolation and being at home when you're normally around people. And we put in quite quickly a lot of welfare support around home working, so ensuring that there were regular sort of social events on Teams, running sort of pub quizzes, things like that, so people are able to interact, ensuring managers were keeping in contact, especially where you had managers being furloughed and their own people being furloughed, ensuring that there was somebody named to look after those people while they were all furloughed. So yeah, the mental health aspect should also be strongly considered.
Yeah, thank you both. Actually, just on that point, Andrew's point about sort of mental health and well-being. So I will talk about this a little bit more at the end, but NCVO, our next webinar is actually going to be on managing and supporting staff, and particularly focusing around, you know, the kind of new flexible furloughing aspect of that. And we are also writing a blog on this. So hopefully, if you are kind of interested in this area, do join us at our next webinar. Okay, next question, and I think this will be relevant for a lot of people, I imagine, on this call. So about if you're a kind of small charity, and there's one example here of a small charity with only 3 part-time staff, just talking about what are the expectations for these organisations? Obviously, they have less resources to kind of manage the situation, and yeah, another comment was that it's very hard to basically keep everyone updated in terms of the COVID-19 secure requirements, including risk assessments. So kind of any kind of insights for small charities in terms of managing this and what's expected. Sarah, can I ask you for that one?
Yeah. Well, the law only requires me to do risk assessments if you've got 5 employees or more. And just to be clear, that does include if there's directors, etc. So they are included in the mix. If you have less than 5 employees, there's no duty on you to do a risk assessment. But there will still be a duty on you to protect the safety, health and welfare of those individuals who come to the workplace to do a work activity. So you'll still need to make sure that some control measures are in place. And like I said, the government has helpfully put the onus on individuals themselves in terms of applying the symptom criteria that the NHS and Public Health England have authorised, also about the hand washing, wearing face coverings, etc. So that has been drilled into people for some months now, so hopefully people are picking that up. But what you may want to be able to do is go into your site and do have a look at how you can, where possible, move desks around so they're side by side rather than face to face. Perhaps have disposable pens at the visitor area so people aren't using the same pens, or people bring their own water bottles, etc., and take them away. Opening windows. There's a lot of things that you can do, and I have circulated, I think, through Josie, a business checklist, a restoration checklist of all little things you might want to consider. I'm not saying that they apply to every organisation, but there might be some useful tips from there that you can pull out and apply to your small operation. But the actual whole documented risk assessment exercise, you wouldn't be required to do that.
Thanks. And just to kind of add to that, so in terms of the business restoration checklist that Sarah mentioned, so that is available on our NCVO know-how site in the coronavirus section. It's under the return to work kind of guidance. So do have a look there. And as we've said, the guidance that we mentioned in this webinar, we will be circulating afterwards. Andrew, I don't know if there's anything more you want to add in terms of, I know that you've developed your tools, so maybe that's something, I don't know if you want to speak more about that.
Yeah, so the checklist is, as I say, online. It tries and assimilates all the advice that's out there into fairly simple steps for people to consider a variety of sizes of organisation, and to ensure that those principles are in place. And yeah, so as I say, it's trying to bring everything together. And as I say, we're finalising the updates from last night, so that should be ready by lunchtime today.
Great, thank you. One question which I think is maybe slightly more HR related, but Sarah, you might have some thoughts on this. So if employees don't feel comfortable returning to work, what might be an approach to deal with this?
It probably does cross into HR, but my initial thoughts are just kind of common sense, trying to understand what their concerns are. It may be they fall into any of the vulnerable or the clinically exceptional vulnerable groups, or they may be shielding somebody at home who falls into those groups. So it's perhaps first of all, just understanding what that basis is it a justified basis? If it's not and it's just concerns, then what you really need to be doing again is providing a summary of the measures that are going to be put in place in the workplace to make sure it's safe for them to attend. And I guess it is a HR question, and I'm happy to follow up with one of my colleagues afterwards and pass the information through to Josie. But if they're still not willing to come, even with control measures in place and reasonable adjustments, then there's obviously other routes you have to take in terms of how you manage that employee. But at the moment, the mandate is still to work from home wherever possible, unless you're essential service or you have to go back. So I guess to try and maintain that, and it may be easier to wait until the government start to alleviate things a little bit more to try and bring those employees who are reluctant to come back. But I'm happy to direct that to a HR colleague of mine, and I can send that through to Josie to circulate. It's a little bit outside my area.
I think that's fine, and I think that's fair. I suppose the thing to say is that the next webinar that I did briefly mention, we are doing in partnership with one of NCVO's trusted suppliers called Krona. And so I think, you know, if you do have those kind of questions about the furloughing scheme and how to approach what your approach might be with returning employees to work, please do join us on that webinar and feel free to ask these questions again. Just also to say, Krona do have a business helpline which is currently available to all voluntary sector organisations. So I think if you do have questions around this kind of issue, do feel free to give their helpline a call, and again I will signpost to that in the follow-up email, and that helpline is free to access. Okay, we've got about 7 more minutes for questions, so do keep them coming in. So Sarah, just wondering, a couple of questions about whether you could talk a little bit more about the requirement for employees to provide face coverings and kind of implement distancing and temperature checks, that like any kind of mandatory requirement, like, yeah, any thoughts on that?
Okay, start with temperature checks first of all. It's not mandatory to do temperature checks. Some people are doing it. I went to a training course the other day and I got temperature checked and then a sticker put on me to saying I complied. So people are introducing different types of measures. I think some people are looking at more technology in terms of that, and looking at thermal monitoring as a CCTV when people come in and out. I think a lot of businesses are looking at that. Temperature monitoring has its pros and its cons. It needs to be effectively managed, and you need to make sure the person who's doing that temperature check perhaps has a face covering, they might have disposable gloves or a plastic apron, and they are stood a required distance away. You also want to think about how you're going to record that information, because it's personal information you're taking there. So it's better just to take the temperature than to make any sort of documentation about it, because that attracts GDPR issues. And temperature testing, like I said, if somebody does have a high temperature, you need to know what you're going to be doing, how you're going to get that person off the premises, and what happens if that does arise. The next question was about, what else was it? Sorry, Josie.
Sorry, no, that's okay. So yeah, so temperature checks, providing face coverings.
Oh, face coverings, yes.
Yeah.
These are readily available by pretty much everybody's now going into the market of making face coverings. And like I said, they are a condition of travel. And when people purchase these from a shop, a retail outlet, it will be very clear in the instructions about how to put them on, how to use them, and how to wash them. I have been giving advice to businesses on those who are willing and want to hand these out to make them readily available. That's fine, but I would make sure there is some sort of short instruction card, and the details of that can be found on websites where people are selling them, about how to safely put them on, safely take them off, and how to wash them and use them. So if you are providing them, you are going to have to provide a little bit of guidance about the use of those face coverings. Some people are deciding to make policy about face coverings if you're in a meeting of more than 6 people in a room, despite it being ventilated and trying to maintain distance. That's some of the requirements people are putting in. So there are ways of using face coverings in your business, and sometimes that might be something you want to pop in your survey when you're doing that return to work survey with employees to see what their thoughts are on that.
Great.
Can I just say something on the...
Yeah, no, go for it, Andrew, sorry.
Yeah, just the one thing on temperature checks, I think people need to be a bit careful. With employees, it's easier, but with members of the public who may be coming on site, there's a whole lot of questions there about consent. So if a person doesn't consent to having their temperature checked, how would you manage that situation? Would you bar them entry, that type of thing? And so sometimes things like that do create more problems than actually being able to having issues to solve. And then, as we know, quite a lot of people are asymptomatic. So a reliance on just something like temperature checks, it doesn't take away the risk. The risk does still exist that you would have someone getting in close contact and spreading. So actually, ultimately, the social distancing and the barrier devices are a lot more effective than taking people's temperatures.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to touch on as well on this test and trace aspect. People are, where Andrew touched on, where we've got visitors and people coming to site that aren't always employees. Some organisations are making sure there's a register, and this is what the government have given advice in relation to pubs and restaurants, of people who are going to your workplace, going to your site, so that you have your details, so that if there is a positive case identified, that this can be provided to the NHS test and trace service, and those people can be contacted. So you might want to think about putting some sort of register or check sheet in that people complete with their details to A, confirm they've got no symptoms, and B, that these are their details, and they don't mind being contacted if there is an identified case through the test and trace. So a lot of people are looking to implement those at the moment as well. I've had to sign a few when I've been to some sites. So that's just another point to think about when people come onto site.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think 2 more questions before we move on. So I think this is more just a confirmation question, really. So do volunteers, Sarah, count as employees? So obviously a lot of people on this call have lots of volunteers and only a few members of staff. So yeah, just to confirm that point.
They count, so under the Health and Safety at Work Act, they probably fall under Section 3, so you still have a duty to protect the health, safety and welfare that you would have as an employee. And sometimes it depends what their role are they becoming a quasi-employee as well? So whether their status is a volunteer, if they're coming onto your workplace and doing an activity under your control, you still have to maintain those duties to protect the safety, health and welfare of them. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Andrew.
Yeah, just to agree with what you've said there, yeah, they do fall under that schedule of the Health and Safety at Work Act, and you would want to provide the equal protection for both. It'll be difficult to justify why it would work for employees and not for volunteers.
Great, thank you. I think a kind of related point, and maybe this is more for Andrew in a way, about what your approach has been in terms of bringing back either volunteers or staff who are over 70 or in that kind of particularly vulnerable category.
So firstly, the government has different categories of vulnerable. There's sort of clinically vulnerable, I think it's called, that they should not come back yet. They are still under the shielding. In terms of our risk assessment, in terms of volunteers, those who are doing frontline work, so who are manning ambulances, providing support in hospitals, have had to pass a fitness for role assessment before they've been able to go out. That has precluded a lot of those people who are not critically clinically vulnerable, but who could be vulnerable, and actually we would not put them in that place. Everybody else, we've gone to very much a virtual working, very much taking on board the government's advice. With regards to returning back, we've included them as part of our risk assessment. We don't intend to bring a lot of people back to frontline until after the summer, and that risk assessment then will pick up what we will do with them with those volunteers. But there's a lot of roles that they're able to perform at the moment while at home. So we have support lines that they can man in terms of those welfare calls, online welfare visits, things like that. So at the moment, they're very much not, we're not bringing them back, but our plan is to, in a very phased return, and safely as per our risk assessment.
Great, thank you. And I think just to add on that, and again, we will signpost here, but we recently released a blog about kind of repurposing volunteer roles. So obviously where you can't bring volunteers back, maybe there are other things that they could be doing and other ways of engaging them. So I will signpost to that in our follow-up email so that you can get some ideas on that. Okay, I think we're now gonna, in the last 10 minutes, move on, but thank you for all the questions. I'm afraid we haven't managed to get through them all, as always, but as I say, we will be doing a follow-up email, and there may be some questions which Sarah can follow up with colleagues and we can get back to you on. So where we can do that, we will endeavour to do so. Okay, so in terms of kind of moving on, so we're going to talk a little bit now about sort of practical support and resources available, and I'm going to start by handing over to Adriano just to talk about the practical support and resources offered by TrustLaw.
Thank you, Josie, and thanks Sarah and Andrew for the brilliant presentations and answering the questions. So I will just give a brief overview of TrustLaw. We are the Thomson Reuters Foundation's pro bono service, and we connect charities and social enterprises with law firms that can provide free legal assistance. We have more than 1,000 partner law firms, including Sarah's law firm, Eversheds Sutherland. So chances are we can help you if you have a legal question. And for instance, if you do need follow-on specific advice on something that's been discussed today, please do get in touch because we can pass the questions on to Sarah's teams or other law firms that can support. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have scaled up our activities to help organizations navigate the crisis. And we've launched some new activities and resources. We created a website listing all the legal resources that have been put together by our legal partners, including the business restoration checklist that Sarah mentioned today. We started running a series of webinars to look at the legal implications of COVID-19, and obviously this is part of that series. And we have created an easy, comprehensive COVID-19 checklist that can help you and your colleagues identify legal challenges and implications of the pandemic on different parts of your operations. For instance, today we've been talking about the implications on health and safety and going back to the office safely, but COVID-19 might have also affected your contractual rights and obligations, your governance, your tax position, and so on. So the checklist is designed to guide you through a number of questions and identify points where you might want additional advice or that you might want to address as a priority. The checklist is freely available on our website. It's there's a link to it in the slides that you have, and we'll send you a link in the follow-on communication. So please do check it out. And finally, we have strengthened our core pro bono connection activities. So we're now making sure that we handle any COVID-19 related matter on an urgent basis, that we can put you in touch with a law firm that can support you as soon as possible. So you know that if you are already a TrustLaw member, you know you can get in touch with us. You can submit a request for support on our online portal, and it's quite simple to do that. And we would always have a chat with you. One of the TrustLaw lawyers will talk to you to identify the legal problem and make sure that the product is scoped out exactly. If you're not a TrustLaw member yet, you can apply to become one. It's an online application. It's free to join. Takes about 15 minutes. So once again, the links to all these are in the slides, so you already have them, and I'll make sure that my contact details are also shared with you after the webinar. So please do get in touch and take advantage of the TrustLaw service. Back to you, Josie. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriano, that's great. Can we move on to the next slide? So yeah, as always, just I'm going to do this very briefly because I'm aware that some of you are probably aware of some of this stuff. So obviously we will be signposting to stuff after this webinar, but also do check out our NCVO know-how guidance, which I've referred to already. All the resources and tools there are currently open to all, so do feel free to have a look. As I mentioned, our next webinar is on Monday next week, and we are focusing on managing and supporting staff in partnership with our trusted supplier, Krona. So do come along, do join us for that. We would really love to hear your feedback. We do get quite a bit of feedback on these, and it is really, really valuable in terms of what webinar to do, giving us ideas for future webinars. We sort of take away key themes that have come up through the questions as well to decide on what we do next. So please do, if you have a chance, give us your feedback, either directly by email, or you can complete our SurveyMonkey questionnaire, which will be sent out in the follow-up email. At the end of this slide, moving on to the next slide, I just highlight a few of the kind of links that I think will be particularly valuable, either from our NCVO coronavirus guidance, or just some links to the TrustLaw resources that hopefully you'll find helpful as well. I think that's it for today. I'm aware we've got, oh, sorry, just to mention, so yes, in the slides, if you do want to get in touch with Andrew, Sarah, or indeed Adriano at TrustLaw, please feel free to do so, and their contact details are there. So yes, so thank you all very much for joining. Really hope that some of you can join us at our next webinar on Monday. And yeah, thank you again. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.